My mom locked me in a room with 6 kids and called it teaching responsibility. When I finally opened up about how tired I was, she smirked and said, "You're lucky we didn't give them away." I stayed silent. That was 9 months ago. This morning she was crying outside the family court because none of them would even look at her. What was the hardest part of being the oldest sibling? My parents forced me to raise all 6 of my younger siblings by myself because they said that's what oldest daughters were for. I was 8 when mom had her second baby and handed him to me saying, "Here's your responsibility." By the time I was 13, there were 6 more kids after me, each one becoming mine. The moment they came home from the hospital, my parents moved all the babies into my room and told everyone they just had one very mature daughter. I thought this was normal. Mom always said oldest daughters in good families raised the younger kids so parents could focus on important things. I believed her because what else did I know? This was my job, my purpose, what I was born to do. The expectation came with a warning that haunted me every day. "If you ever complain or tell anyone you need help," Mom said, holding baby Oliver, "social services will take all these kids away. They'll split you up, put you in different homes. You'll never see each other again. Is that what you want?" I was 9 years old and the thought of losing them made me sob. She smiled and handed Oliver to me. "That's what I thought. You're their only chance at staying together." I handled everything while my parents lived like a carefree couple. Midnight feedings, potty training, homework help, doctor visits. They'd walk past crying babies like they were invisible. At restaurants, they'd get a table for 2 while I managed 6 kids at a separate table. When strangers asked if I was the babysitter, I'd smile and nod because the truth might mean losing everything. My parents had given me 6 hostages disguised as siblings, but each one of them had carved out a piece of my heart. Leo, the baby, only slept if I rubbed his back in exactly the right way. The twins, Luna and Ruby, had their own language but always translated for me. Oliver, at 10, still crawled into my bed during thunderstorms. Ethan drew me pictures every day that said, "I love you, Mama," in crayon. Little Ivy called me her best friend. I was drowning and desperate but could never ask for help because I was so afraid they'd be taken from me. I was the only parent they knew. They were all safe and okay. I couldn't risk ruining that. The school counselor noticed my exhaustion and offered to connect me with resources. I almost broke down and told her everything. But then I imagined Luna crying in some foster home, wondering why I let them take her away. So I smiled and said I just needed more sleep. By 13, I was a ghost of myself. I'd wake at 5 a.m. to pack lunches, braid hair, find matching socks for 6 kids. I'd missed so much school that letters came home, but I forged Mom's signature and prayed no one would call. Sometimes I'd fall asleep sitting up, still holding Leo. The truancy officer finally came to investigate. My parents acted shocked I'd been missing school. "We had no idea," Mom said sweetly. He shot me a look that said everything. One word and they're gone forever. So I took the blame. Said I'd been skipping and accepted the consequences. Then my parents planned a week-long cruise, leaving me with 6 kids and $50. 3 days in, Luna fell off the playground and split her chin open. At the hospital, I held her while she sobbed into my neck, her blood soaking my shirt, her tiny hands gripping me like I was the only safe thing in the world. They wouldn't treat her without a parent. I sat there for 3 hours, my baby sister bleeding and crying, while I tried to forge signatures that might save her. I finally broke and called my grandmother. When she arrived and saw me covered in Luna's blood, trying to comfort 5 other terrified siblings while nurses debated calling social services, her face changed. She got Luna treated, then loaded us all into her van. "Please don't let them take us away from each other," I begged her. "I know I'm not doing good enough, but they're all I have and I'm all they have, and if you tell anyone, they'll split us up." I was sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. Grandma pulled over and held me while I fell apart. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "What have they done to you?" For the first time in 5 years, an adult saw what was happening and I was terrified of what would come next. My parents came home to an empty house and called the police. At Grandma's house, they spun their story perfectly. "Our daughter won't let us parent," Mom cried. "She threatens the little ones, tells them we'll abandon them if they come to us for anything. We've tried to help, but she's created this sick situation where they're all trauma bonded to her." The social worker separated us for questioning. I could hear Leo screaming for me through the walls, and every cry felt like my heart being ripped out. This was it, the moment Mom had warned me about. They were going to take my babies away. "She's poisoned them against us," Dad said. "We're concerned she might hurt them or herself if we forcibly separate them. That's why we've been careful, trying to gradually re-establish normal boundaries." I could see my grandmother start to wonder if they were telling the truth. The social worker looked troubled. She asked my siblings who took care of them, and even Oliver just said, "Mama," and pointed at me. I saw her writing severe attachment disorder in her notes. She started making calls about emergency placement. We'd be split up by morning, sent to different homes across the state. I was going to lose the only people that mattered to me, the only reason I had for living. All because I'd never been allowed to just be their sister like I should have been. Mom caught my eye and mouthed, "I warned you." The social worker's pen scratched across her clipboard while my world crumbled through the thin walls. Leo's screams grew more desperate. My arms ached to hold him, to tell him everything would be okay, even though I knew it wouldn't be. Grandma shifted in her chair beside me. Her hand found mine under the table and squeezed. The doubt I'd seen creeping into her eyes earlier seemed to waver as she watched my parents' performance. Mom dabbed her eyes with a tissue, though no actual tears fell. She'd perfected this act over years of school conferences and doctor visits. Dad rubbed her shoulder and practiced sympathy while shooting me warning glances whenever the social worker looked away. The social worker, Miss Chen, flipped through her notes. She had separated us all for individual interviews, standard protocol she'd explained. Now we sat in Grandma's living room for what felt like a verdict on our lives. Oliver's voice drifted through the wall, high and scared. He was asking for me. Not Mom or Dad. Me, because I was the one who checked for monsters under his bed and knew exactly how he liked his sandwiches cut. Miss Chen cleared her throat. She looked tired, like she'd seen too many broken families to count. Her eyes moved between my parents and me, calculating. Mom leaned forward, all maternal concern. She explained how worried they were about my mental state, how I'd threatened to harm myself if separated from the children. Lies wrapped in just enough truth to sound believable. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Dad cut me off with a story about finding me asleep standing up, still holding Leo at 3 a.m. He made it sound like negligence instead of exhaustion. Made it seem like I was the danger instead of the solution to their abandonment. Grandma's grip on my hand tightened. She'd been quiet since my parents arrived, processing everything she'd witnessed. The blood on my shirt from Luna's injury had dried to rust-colored stains, evidence of how alone I'd been when it mattered most. Miss Chen asked about the hospital incident. Mom's face crumbled into practiced devastation as she explained how I'd taken Luna without permission, forged signatures, refused to call them. She left out the part where they'd been unreachable on a cruise ship. The lies stacked up like blocks, each one building a case against me. I was unstable. I was controlling. I was creating unhealthy attachments. I was the problem that needed solving. Through it all, my siblings' voices filtered through the walls. Ruby asking when she could see me. Ethan crying because he wanted to show me his new drawing. Ivy's little voice insisting I was her best friend, not her sister. Miss Chen wrote everything down. Her pen moved across the page in neat lines that would determine our futures. 7 lives hanging on her interpretation of a situation too twisted for any manual to cover. Dad launched into another story. This one about finding me teaching the twins that our parents didn't love them. Another lie with a grain of truth. I'd never said those words, but I'd held them while they cried after Mom walked past them like furniture. I'd explained that some people showed love differently, even when I didn't believe it myself. The front door opened and Miss Chen's colleague entered with my siblings trailing behind. Leo lunged for me the second he saw me, his little body shaking with relief. I caught him and held tight, knowing this might be the last time. One by one they gravitated to me. Ivy climbed into my lap beside Leo. The twins pressed against my sides. Oliver stood behind me with his hands on my shoulders. Even Ethan, trying to be brave at 7, leaned against my knee. Mom made a soft sound of distress. Dad shook his head sadly, as if this proved their point about unhealthy attachment. But Grandma was watching something else entirely. She saw how I automatically checked Luna's bandage, how I shifted to accommodate all of them without thinking, how my body curved protectively around them like I'd done it 1,000 times before. As I had. Miss Chen observed our cluster with professional interest. She made more notes while Mom explained how the children refused to accept appropriate boundaries. How they'd been conditioned to rely solely on me. Something didn't add up about these parents' story. They're crying about their daughter not letting them parent while the social worker is literally watching all 6 kids cling to their sister like she's their whole world. Leo buried his face in my neck. His breath was warm and shaky against my skin. I rubbed his back in the specific pattern that helped him calm down. Muscle memory taking over. Grandma suddenly spoke up. Her voice cut through Mom's monologue with quiet authority. She asked Miss Chen Grandma asked if she could share some observations from the past few days. Mom's face tightened. This wasn't part of their plan. They'd expected Grandma to be confused, overwhelmed, easy to manipulate. They hadn't counted on her really seeing us. Grandma described finding me at the hospital, covered in Luna's blood, but keeping 5 other children calm. She talked about watching me manage breakfast that morning, how each child got exactly what they needed without me asking. She mentioned the homework folders I'd organized, the permission slips I'd signed, the lunches I'd packed with notes in each one. Dad tried to interrupt, but Grandma kept going. She described the bedtime routine she'd witnessed, how I'd read 3 different stories to accommodate different age groups, checked on everyone twice, responded to every call for water or monsters or just reassurance. Mom's mask slipped for just a second. Raw annoyance flashed across her face before she caught herself. But Grandma saw it. And more importantly, Miss Chen saw it. The social worker asked to speak with Grandma privately. They stepped into the kitchen, leaving us with my parents and Miss Chen's colleague. The silence stretched tight enough to snap. Mom stared at me with eyes that promised consequences. Dad's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't say in front of witnesses. My siblings pressed closer, sensing the danger, even if they didn't understand it. Minutes passed like hours. Leo fell asleep against my chest, exhausted from crying. The twins whispered to each other in their special language. Oliver's hands on my shoulders trembled slightly. When Grandma and Miss Chen returned, something had shifted. Miss Chen looked at our huddle with different eyes. She saw past the attachment disorder to something else, something that made her pen pause over her clipboard. She announced that she needed to do a home visit to see where we'd been living, how we'd been managing. Mom's smile went rigid. Dad's hand clenched on his knee. They tried to refuse, citing privacy concerns in the late hour. But Miss Chen insisted. It was protocol, she explained. She needed to see the children's living environment to make a proper assessment. Grandma offered to drive us all. Mom and Dad had no choice but to agree, or look like they had something to hide. We loaded into vehicles, my siblings still clinging to me like lifelines. The drive to our house felt like heading to an execution. Every mile brought us closer to evidence I'd hidden for years. The single bed where all 7 of us slept, the lock on the outside of my door, the calendar where I tracked everything because I was too exhausted to remember. Mom chatted pleasantly with Miss Chen during the drive, spinning stories about family game nights that never happened and vacations we'd never taken. Dad added supporting details with practiced ease. But Luna chose that moment to speak up from her car seat. Her small voice carried clearly in the confined space. She asked if we were going back to the room. Just the room. Not home. Not our house. Room. Miss Chen's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. She asked Luna what room she meant. And my brave, injured little sister explained in her matter-of-fact way that we all stayed in one room always, because that's where I was and I kept them safe. Mom laughed high and false. She explained that the children liked having sleepovers in their big sister's room. Wasn't that sweet? Didn't all siblings do that? But Ruby, not to be outdone by her twin, added that we didn't have sleepovers. We lived there. All our clothes were there. Our toys. Everything. Because Mama needed us close to take care of us. The car fell silent except for the sound of tires on asphalt. Mom's knuckles went white where she gripped her purse. Dad stared straight ahead like he could will us to disappear. We pulled into our driveway. The house looked normal from the outside. 2 stories. Nice yard. Suburban dream. No one would guess what happened inside. Miss Chen asked to see the children's rooms, plural. Mom led the way, heels clicking on hardwood, explaining about recent renovations that hadn't happened and organizational systems that didn't exist. She opened doors to pristine bedrooms that belonged to no one. Guest rooms with dusty surfaces and empty closets. Spaces decorated for children who'd never slept there. Then we reached my room. The room. Mom's hand hesitated on the doorknob. Dad suggested maybe we could skip it, since it was probably messy. Teenage girls, you know how they are. But Miss Chen insisted. When the door opened, the truth was laid bare. One twin bed pushed against the wall. A crib crammed in the corner. Sleeping bags rolled up in the closet. A single dresser overflowing with clothes for 7 children in various sizes. The lock on the outside of the door that had kept us in during their dinner parties. Miss Chen stepped inside slowly, taking in every detail. The homework station I'd created from a card table. The color-coded bins for each child's school supplies. The schedule taped to the wall. Tracking feeding times, diaper changes, permission slip deadlines. Mom started explaining rapidly. Something about me insisting on this arrangement. Something about teenage rebellion and control issues. But her voice had gone shrill. Desperate. Miss Chen examined the lock on the door. He tested it, noting how it only worked from the outside. She asked why a teenager's door would need to lock from the outside. Dad mumbled about safety. About keeping the younger children from wandering at night. But Oliver, brave Oliver who still called me Mama when he was scared, spoke up. He explained how the lock kept us in when they had company. How I taught them to be quiet when we heard it click. How I'd made it a game, pretending we were hiding from dragons so the little ones wouldn't cry and make them angry. The truth spilled out in pieces. Ethan showed his drawings, all addressed to Mama, all featuring 7 little figures and no adults. Ivy explained how I fixed her always because the other grown-ups were too busy. Luna described how I sang them to sleep every night while house party music thumped through the walls. Miss Chen took pictures. She made notes. She asked careful questions that my siblings answered with innocent honesty. Each word was another crack in my parents' facade. Mom tried one last manipulation. She pulled Miss Chen aside and whispered about her concerns for my mental health. How I'd been showing signs of delusion, believing I was their mother. How they'd been trying to get me help but I refused. But Grandma had heard enough. She'd been silent through the house tour, watching everything with growing horror. Now she spoke up, her voice shaking with controlled fury. She asked my parents when they'd last fed their children. When they'd last helped with homework, kissed a scraped knee or read a bedtime story. She asked them to name their children's teachers, their favorite foods, their fears. Silence. Dad tried to deflect but Grandma wasn't done. She asked why a 13-year-old had permission slip forms in her backpack. Why her granddaughter had dry bloodstains on her shirt from an injury they didn't even know had happened. Why she knew the pediatrician's number by heart. Why the only recent family photos were selfies I'd taken with my siblings. Mom's mask finally shattered completely. She snapped that they'd given me everything. A roof over my head, food to eat, siblings to love. What more did I want? Love I thought but didn't say. Parents. A childhood. The chance to be a sister instead of a mother. But those words stayed locked in my throat like they'd been trained to. Miss Chen had seen enough. She announced that she needed to make some calls, consult with her supervisor. In the meantime, she strongly recommended the children return to Grandma's house for the night. Mom protested but it wasn't a request. Miss Chen's tone made that clear. She would be in touch tomorrow with next steps. There would be a formal investigation. Home visits, interviews, court involvement if necessary. The word court made my stomach drop but Grandma's hand found mine again. Steady and sure. She'd seen the truth now. She understood what they'd done, to me, to us. We gathered what we could carry. Favorite stuffed animals. Leo's special blanket. The twins' shared pillow. Mom and Dad watched from the doorway, their perfect parent performance finally over. As we loaded back into Grandma's van, Mom caught my arm. Her nails dug in just enough to hurt. She leaned close, her breath hot against my ear. She reminded me what happened to children in foster care. How they got split up, sent to different states. How some never saw each other again. How this was all my fault for not being grateful. But Grandma, she stepped between us, breaking Mom's grip. She told my mother that the only fault here was theirs. That what they'd done had a name, and that name was abuse. We drove away in silence. My siblings dozed around me, exhausted from the emotional upheaval. I stared out the window at passing streetlights, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The streetlights blurred past as Grandma navigated through familiar neighborhoods. I held Leo tighter, his small body radiating warmth against my chest. The twins had fallen asleep holding hands across my lap, and Oliver's head rested heavy on my shoulder. Only Ethan and Ivy remained awake, their eyes wide with confusion. Grandma's house appeared like a sanctuary in the darkness. We stumbled inside, exhausted children clinging to whatever part of me they could reach. I settled them in the guest room, maintaining our usual sleeping arrangement because anything else would have terrified them. Leo whimpered when I tried to put him down, his fingers tangled in my shirt. Miss Chin had just watched 7 kids' entire childhood unravel faster than a cheap sweater. And Mom was still trying to sell her the concerned parent act, while standing next to a bedroom door that locks from the outside. Talk about reading the room wrong. The house phone rang just as I'd gotten everyone settled. Grandma answered in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the thin walls. Mom's shrill tone penetrated even from a distance, making accusations and demands. Grandma hung up mid-sentence. She appeared in the doorway, her face grim. She explained that my parents were already working on their next move. They'd called their lawyer friend, someone who owed Dad a favor from years back. The manipulation machine was already spinning. I tucked blankets around my siblings, my hands moving automatically through routines I'd perfected over years. Grandma watched from the doorway, her expression shifting between anger and sorrow. She whispered that she should have known, should have visited more often. I shook my head. My parents had been too good at their performance. Morning arrived too quickly. Miss Chin called early, scheduling another meeting for that afternoon. She needed to interview each child separately, she explained. Standard procedure for cases involving multiple minors. My stomach churned at the thought of my siblings being questioned alone. Grandma made breakfast while I dressed the little ones. She bought clothes that actually fit them, something my parents had never bothered with. Ivy twirled in her new dress, delighted by the bright flowers printed across the fabric. Such a simple thing, but it made my chest tight with emotion. Grandma made breakfast while I dressed the little ones. She bought clothes that actually fit them, something my parents had never bothered with. Ivy twirled in her new dress, delighted by the bright flowers printed across the fabric. Such a simple thing, but it made my chest tight with emotion. The doorbell rang just as we finished eating. My parents stood on the porch, dressed impeccably. Mom wore her church outfit, the one that made her look like a devoted mother. Dad had his arm around her shoulders in practiced solidarity. They brought a woman with them. She introduced herself as their family counselor, someone they'd been seeing to address the situation with me. Another lie, but one impossible to disprove. The counselor spoke softly about family dysfunction and enabling behaviors, using clinical terms that made me sound disturbed. Grandma refused to let them inside. The conversation happened on the porch. My siblings pressed against the windows watching. Mom noticed and waved, her smile bright and false. None of them waved back. The counselor handed Grandma a folder. Inside were printed emails, supposedly from teachers, expressing concern about my possessive behavior with my siblings. I knew immediately. The dates were wrong, the language too formal, but doubt flickered across Grandma's face. My parents left with promises to return with their lawyer. The counselor patted my shoulder as she passed, whispering that help was available when I was ready to accept it. Her touch made my skin crawl. Inside, Grandma spread the papers across her kitchen table. She studied each one carefully while I tried to keep my siblings occupied. But Oliver had heard enough. He crept to my side and pressed a crumpled paper into my hand. His school journal, the one I'd helped him with last month. The entry was about family. He'd drawn our house with stick figures, 7 small ones clustered in a single room, 2 larger ones standing far away. His teacher's comment in red pen: Oliver seems confused about family roles. Please discuss at conference. Grandma read it and her jaw tightened. She asked Oliver, who had attended his parent-teacher conference. He pointed at me, explaining how I'd had to pretend to be the babysitter, because parents were supposed to come, not sisters. Grandma began making calls. Her church friends. Other grandmothers who'd raised concerns about never seeing my siblings. Pieces of a puzzle my parents hadn't realized existed. Mrs. Patterson from down the street remembered seeing me walking 6 kids to the bus stop every morning while my parents' cars sat in the driveway. Miss Chin arrived promptly at 2. She brought a colleague, someone who specialized in cases involving multiple children. They set up in different rooms, preparing to interview each child separately. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't protect them from questions I couldn't hear. Leo went first, carried by Miss Chen's colleague, because he refused to walk away from me. His screams echoed through the house for 20 minutes before they gave up and brought him back. He burrowed into my arms, trembling. The twins went together, insisting they couldn't be separated. Through the closed door, I heard Ruby's clear voice explaining their daily routine. How I braided their hair each morning because Mom said it wasn't her job. How I knew which twin liked peanut butter and which preferred jelly. Oliver surprised me. He walked into the room with his shoulders squared, my brave boy trying to protect us all. He emerged 30 minutes later with red eyes but determination on his face. He whispered that he told them everything about the lock on the door. Ethan brought his drawings. I watched him carry a whole stack into the interview room. When he came out, Miss Chen's colleague followed, holding one particular picture. It showed a figure labeled Mama, surrounded by smaller figures, while 2 adult shapes stood outside a thick black border. Ivy went last, clutching the doll Grandma had given her that morning. She chatted nervously as Miss Chen led her away. Through the door, her voice carried clearly as she explained how I fixed her always and read her stories and checked for monsters because the other grown-ups were always too busy. While they interviewed my siblings, Miss Chin questioned me in the kitchen. She asked about daily routines, medical care, educational decisions. I answered honestly, too exhausted to maintain any pretense. She took notes as I explained forging permission slips and parent signatures, about missing school for pediatrician appointments, about stretching $50 to feed 7 kids for a week. She asked why I'd never told anyone. The question hung heavy between us. How could I explain years of psychological conditioning, the constant threat of separation, the way Mom had made me believe I was the only thing standing between my siblings and disaster? I tried anyway. I told her about the warnings that started when Oliver was born, the stories about foster care that gave me nightmares, the time Mom had driven us past a group home and described in detail how my siblings would suffer there because of my selfishness. Miss Chen's expression shifted. She asked if I'd ever been allowed to have friends over, if I'd attended school events or activities, if I'd had any life outside caring for my siblings. The answer to everything was no. The interviews concluded as evening approached. Miss Chin and her colleague conferred quietly while I made dinner with Grandma's help. My siblings clung closer than usual, unsettled by the questions and separation. Leo hadn't let go of me since his interview attempt. Miss Chin explained their preliminary findings. The children showed clear signs of parentification and role confusion. My siblings genuinely believed I was their primary caregiver. They showed minimal attachment to our parents and significant anxiety when separated from me. She scheduled a formal assessment for the next day. A child psychologist would evaluate our family dynamics. In the meantime, she strongly recommended the children remain in Grandma's care. She gave my parents this news over the phone, and I could hear Mom's explosion from across the room. That night I barely slept. My siblings piled around me like usual, seeking comfort and familiarity. But my mind raced with possibilities. What if the psychologist agreed with my parents? What if they decided I was the problem? What if splitting us up really was the best solution? The morning brought new challenges. My parents arrived with their lawyer, a man who smiled too much and spoke in careful, measured tones. He presented documents about grandparent rights and custody arrangements, using legal terms designed to confuse and intimidate. The grandma had made calls too. Her friend's daughter was a family law attorney who agreed to advise us pro bono. She arrived just as the meeting began, matching the other lawyer's smile with steel in her eyes. The psychologist arrived separately. Dr. Martinez was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Ivy at ease. She observed our morning routine without interfering, taking notes as I helped Oliver tie his shoes and braided the twins' hair. My parents performed beautifully. They greeted each child warmly, though Leo screamed when Dad reached for him. Mom explained it away as a phase, temporary confusion that would resolve once proper boundaries were established. She'd researched attachment disorders extensively overnight. Dr. Martinez conducted her evaluation through observation and play. She watched how my siblings naturally oriented toward me, how they sought my approval before answering questions, how they looked to me for comfort when confused or scared. She observed my parents too, how Mom's smile never reached her eyes when she looked at the younger children, how Dad checked his phone constantly, more interested in work emails than his children's activities, how neither of them knew which twin was which without checking the small birthmark on Luna's wrist. The lawyer tried to control the narrative. He presented my parents as victims of a disturbed teenager who inserted herself inappropriately into a parental role. He had printouts from online forums about sibling abuse, highlighting passages about older children who manipulated younger ones. But then Oliver did something unexpected. He walked to the table where the adults sat and placed his journal in front of Dr. Martinez. He'd written a new entry that morning, asking me to help him spell the words correctly. My sister takes care of us because nobody else does. She isn't mean. She loves us. Please don't take her away. Mom's mask slipped. She snapped at Oliver for lying, for being manipulated, for not understanding the situation. Her voice rose sharp enough to make Ivy cry. Oliver's journal entries kept appearing at exactly the right moments. First, the drawing his teacher commented on. Now this perfectly timed declaration. These kids seemed remarkably organized for being so young, passing notes and keeping evidence like tiny detectives building a case against their own parents. Dad tried to calm her, but the damage was done. Dr. Martinez had seen the real woman behind the performance. The evaluation continued for hours. Dr. Martinez interviewed Grandma about her observations. Mrs. Patterson from down the street arrived unexpectedly, having heard about the situation from church friends. She testified about seeing me manage 6 children alone, about my parents' cars in the driveway while I walked everyone to school in the rain. My old teacher, Miss Roberts, came too. She kept records of every forged signature, every missed parent conference where I'd shown up instead. Every time she tried to contact my parents about my absences, only to be told I was going through a phase. The evidence mounted like building blocks. Each person added another piece to the picture of neglect and abandonment my parents had carefully hidden. Mom grew increasingly agitated, her perfect mother facade cracking with each testimony. She finally exploded when the school counselor arrived with documentation of my declining grades and exhaustion. Mom accused everyone of conspiring against her, of trying to steal her children, of not understanding how difficult I'd made things. Dad tried damage control, but it was too late. Dr. Martinez had seen enough. She announced she needed to make her report to Miss Chin immediately. The formal recommendation would take time, but her initial assessment was clear. The children had been subjected to severe parentification and emotional neglect. My parents' lawyer tried to argue, but even he seemed to realize the battle was shifting. He advised them to leave before more damage was done. Mom refused at first, making wild accusations about Grandma poisoning the children against her. But when Leo started crying and reaching for me, when the twins hid behind my legs, when even brave Oliver backed away from her approach, she finally stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. They left with threats of court battles and custody fights. The lawyer promised this wasn't over, that parents had rights. That one bad day didn't erase years of providing food and shelter. But his words rang hollow against the evidence of systematic neglect. That evening, Miss Chin returned with official documents. Emergency custody was being transferred to Grandma, temporarily. A full investigation would follow, but for now we could stay together. The relief nearly knocked me off my feet. Grandma signed papers while I held my siblings close. They didn't understand the legal complexities, but they knew something important had happened. Ivy asked if we could stay forever. I couldn't answer through the tears. Miss Chin explained the next steps. There would be court hearings, custody evaluations, mandatory family counseling. My parents would have supervised visitation rights. Initially, the process would be long and difficult, but the immediate danger had passed. She pulled me aside privately. She acknowledged what I'd done, the impossible situation I'd been forced into. She promised that keeping us together was the priority. That no one would punish me for protecting my siblings the only way I knew how. That night, Grandma tucked us all into beds she'd hastily assembled in her guest rooms. Real beds with clean sheets and enough space for everyone. Leo still insisted on sleeping next to me, but for the first time it felt like a choice rather than a necessity. I lay awake listening to their peaceful breathing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. My parents wouldn't give up easily. There would be court dates and evaluations and questions I didn't want to answer. But tonight we were safe. We were together. And for the first time in 5 years, I had an adult who truly wanted to help. Grandma appeared in the doorway, checking on us one more time. She whispered that she'd hired a better lawyer. Someone who specialized in cases like ours. Someone who understood that family wasn't just about blood, but about who showed up when it mattered. The coming weeks would test us all. My parents would try every manipulation, every legal maneuver, every emotional weapon in their arsenal. But something had fundamentally shifted. The truth was out. The performance was over. And I was no longer alone in protecting the only family that mattered to me. The next morning brought chaos to Grandma's doorstep. My parents arrived with 2 lawyers this time, their expressions cold and calculated. Mom wore a conservative suit that made her look like a grieving mother. Dad carried a thick folder of documents. They'd filed emergency motions overnight. Their lawyers presented papers claiming I'd kidnapped my siblings. That Grandma was enabling a dangerous situation. They demanded immediate return of the children pending a full investigation. Grandma's lawyer reviewed the documents while I kept my siblings in the back room. Through the window, I watched Mom dab at dry eyes for the lawyer's benefit. Dad checked his watch repeatedly, annoyed at the inconvenience. Miss Chin arrived within the hour, accompanied by her supervisor. They'd received the emergency filing and needed to assess the situation immediately. My stomach churned as they explained that such serious allegations required immediate action. The supervisor, a stern woman named Mrs. Thornton, insisted on interviewing me alone. Grandma's lawyer advised me to answer honestly but carefully. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, my hands trembling in my lap. She asked pointed questions about the night I'd called Grandma. Had I taken the children without permission? Technically yes, though my parents had left us alone. Had I refused to return them? Yes, because they'd abandoned us for a cruise. Each truthful answer sounded damning without context. Meanwhile, my parents' lawyers interviewed Grandma in the living room. I could hear Mom's voice rising occasionally, playing the victim perfectly. She'd learned new phrases overnight about parental alienation and emotional manipulation. Oliver crept into the kitchen despite instructions to stay back. He pressed against my side, and Mrs. Thornton watched our interaction carefully. When she asked him who took care of him, he pointed at me without hesitation. She wrote something in her notes that made my chest tighten. The twins escaped next, drawn by Oliver's absence. They climbed into my lap like they'd done 1,000 times before. Ruby explained to Mrs. Thornton that I braided their hair every morning because I was the only one who knew how. Luna added that I cut the crust off their sandwiches just right. Mrs. Thornton observed how naturally they oriented to me, how I responded to their needs without thinking. She asked if they ever went to their parents for comfort. The twins looked confused by the question. Ruby finally said they tried once, but Mom said she was busy. By afternoon, all my siblings had found their way to the kitchen. Even Leo, who should have been napping, toddled in dragging his blanket. He climbed into my arms and fell asleep against my chest, his thumb in his mouth. Mrs. Thornton watched me juggle 6 children effortlessly. I helped Ethan with a splinter while holding Leo, mediated a dispute between the twins over a crayon, reminded Oliver about his inhaler, and fixed Ivy's twisted sock, all while answering questions. She asked about medical care. I rattled off vaccination schedules, allergies, medications, and the pediatrician's direct number from memory. When she asked my parents the same questions later, they couldn't name a single allergy or medication. The lawyers argued for hours. My parents' team insisted on immediate return, claiming every moment away constituted further psychological damage. Grandma's lawyer countered with documentation of neglect and abandonment. Dr. Martinez arrived for an emergency session. She'd been asked to provide an immediate assessment given the serious allegations. My parents performed their routine again, but cracks showed. Mom snapped at Ivy for interrupting. Dad ignored Leo's outstretched arms, too focused on his phone. During a break, I overheard Mom whispering furiously to her lawyer. She wanted to know why this was taking so long, why they couldn't just take their property and leave. The lawyer reminded her to call them children, not property. Her mask had slipped enough that even he noticed. Mrs. Thornton pulled me aside privately. She acknowledged the unusual situation but said the allegations were serious. If my parents could prove kidnapping, I could face charges. The room spun at the thought of jail, of leaving my siblings completely unprotected. But then she added something else. She'd seen enough cases to recognize the truth. She advised me to stay calm, keep caring for my siblings normally and trust the process. Her eyes held an understanding that made me want to cry. Evening approached with no resolution. The lawyers agreed to reconvene tomorrow with a family court judge present. My parents left with threats about criminal charges and lawsuits. Mom's parting look promised retribution. That night I barely slept again. Every sound made me think police were coming to arrest me. Leo woke repeatedly, sensing my distress. I held him close, memorizing his weight in my arms in case it was the last time. Morning brought a circus to Grandma's lawn. My parents had called extended family, painting themselves as victims of a teenage rebellion. Aunts and uncles I'd never met stood outside, demanding to see the children they'd never bothered to visit. Grandma refused to let them in. They shouted accusations about brainwashing and elder abuse. Someone called the police, claiming a hostage situation. 2 officers arrived, looking weary at the family drama. They interviewed everyone separately. By now my siblings' story never wavered. I took care of them. I'd always taken care of them. The officers noted the lock on my bedroom door and the photos Miss Chin had taken. The single bed for 7 children. The evidence of systematic neglect. The family court judge arrived at noon. Leo picking the worst possible time to need comfort. Perfect toddler timing. Nothing says, let's make this custody evaluation interesting, like a sleepy baby choosing the exact moment legal threats fly to demand cuddles from his sister mom. Judge Reeves was an older woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She commandeered Grandma's dining room as a makeshift courtroom, though she emphasized this was just a preliminary hearing. My parents presented their case first. Their lawyers painted a picture of concerned parents trying to retrieve children from a disturbed teenager's control. They had character witnesses, friends who'd never questioned why they never saw the children, who believed whatever story they'd been told. But then the evidence mounted against them. Miss Chin presented her findings. Dr. Martinez explained parentification and role reversal. Mrs. Thornton, despite her initial skepticism, testified about observing me manage 6 children with more skill than most adults. The judge asked to speak with each child. My parents' lawyer objected, but she overruled him. One by one my siblings told their truth. Oliver explained about the lock. The twins described sleeping on the floor. Ethan showed his drawings. Ivy talked about being hungry when I wasn't there to make food. Leo was last. At 2 he could barely testify, but his actions spoke volumes. When the judge asked him to go to his mommy, he toddled straight to me. When she clarified she meant his other mommy, he looked confused and pressed closer to me. My parents' lawyer tried damage control. He argued about biological rights, about temporary confusion, about the need for professional intervention to restore proper bonds. But the judge had seen enough. She issued a preliminary ruling. The children would remain with Grandma under emergency custody. My parents would have supervised visitation only, pending full psychological evaluations. Any criminal charges were dismissed as unfounded, given the evidence of abandonment. Mom exploded. She screamed about her rights, about the injustice, about how we'd all regret this. Dad tried to calm her, but she turned on him too, blaming him for not controlling the situation better. Their perfect unity cracked in front of everyone. The extended family melted away, embarrassed by the scene. The friends who'd come as character witnesses left quietly. In the end, my parents stood alone on Grandma's lawn, their performance finally over with no audience left to appreciate it. But they weren't done. Over the following weeks they tried every angle. They reported Grandma for elder abuse. They called CPS with anonymous tips about substance use. They filed complaints with the school board about truancy. Each investigation found the same thing. 7 children thriving in Grandma's care. Perfect attendance now that I didn't have to miss school. Grades improving. Leo speaking more words every day. The twins growing confident enough to play separately sometimes. The supervised visits were disasters. Mom spent the entire time trying to interrogate the children about what they told the judge. Dad sat in the corner on his phone, occasionally looking up to complain about missing work. The supervisor ended several visits early due to inappropriate behavior. They tried manipulation through gifts. Expensive toys appeared at visits, bribes for affection, but Oliver pushed away the remote control car, saying he'd rather have someone read to him. The twins ignored the fancy dolls, asking instead why Mom never braided their hair. Their lawyer advised them to show genuine change. They enrolled in parenting classes but attended sporadically. They started therapy but fired 3 therapists who suggested they might be at fault. They couldn't fake accountability because they genuinely believed they'd done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, life at Grandma's house settled into new rhythms. I still woke early from habit, but now Grandma helped with breakfast. My siblings still came to me for comfort, but they began to trust Grandma too. Leo even napped in her arms sometimes. School became possible again. I joined study groups, made a friend, even attended a school dance. My siblings thrived with consistent care and actual parenting. Oliver's anxiety decreased. The twins developed individual personalities. Ethan's drawings showed happy figures now. The final custody hearing arrived 6 months later. My parents entered with new lawyers, their fourth set. They'd crafted a new narrative about temporary mental health struggles, about being overwhelmed, about wanting to repair their family. But the evidence was overwhelming. 6 months of failed supervised visits. Multiple professionals testifying about the damage done. My siblings' clear preference documented extensively. Even their new lawyer seemed to know they were fighting a losing battle. I testified last. The judge asked me directly what I wanted. For the first time in 6 years, I spoke my truth in front of my parents without fear. I explained the exhaustion, the isolation, the constant terror of separation. I described raising 6 children while being a child myself. Mom tried to interrupt to correct my lies, but the judge silenced her. I continued, explaining how I loved my siblings, but wanted to be their sister, not their mother. How they deserved real parents, not owners who saw them as burdens. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Full custody to grandma. My parents' rights reduced to supervised visits every other week, contingent on completing therapy and parenting classes. The parentification was noted as severe emotional abuse in official records. My parents left without a word to any of us. Their performance had no finale, no dramatic exit. They simply walked out, already discussing an appeal with their lawyers. But everyone knew it was over. They'd lost their audience permanently. That night we celebrated quietly. Grandma made a special dinner. My siblings drew pictures and sang songs. Leo took his first independent steps across the living room, finally confident enough to let go. We cheered like he'd won an Olympic medal. Months passed. My parents' visits became less frequent. They'd cancel for work trips or social events. Eventually they moved 2 states away for a fresh start. Their visits dropped to monthly, then holidays only, then hardly at all. I started therapy to process 6 years of trauma. My siblings attended play therapy to learn healthy attachments. Grandma took parenting classes voluntarily, determined to give us everything we'd missed. We weren't perfect, but we were healing. On my 15th birthday, Grandma threw me a real party. Friends from school came. We played silly games and ate too much cake. My siblings made me cards with drawings and misspelled words that meant everything. For the first time, I felt like a teenager. The adoption finalization came through on a rainy Tuesday. Grandma officially became our legal guardian. Permanently. My parents hadn't contested it, too busy with their new lives to fight anymore. We stood in the judge's chambers. All 7 of us, plus Grandma, becoming a legal family. That evening, I tucked my siblings into their own beds in their own rooms. They still sometimes climbed in with me during storms, but by choice now, not necessity. I kissed each forehead, said goodnight, and walked to my own room. My room with posters on the walls and homework on my desk. With a door that locked from the inside if I wanted privacy. With space for just me because I was 15 and that's what 15-year-olds deserved. Grandma appeared in my doorway for our new nightly ritual. She asked if everyone was settled, if I needed anything, if I was okay. Such simple questions, but they meant everything. Someone else was checking, caring, parenting. I pulled out my journal, a gift from my therapist. Inside I wrote about normal teenage things. School drama, crush updates, weekend plans. The entries were boring and beautiful. Exactly what they should be. My siblings were safe, loved, and thriving. And finally, so was I. Thanks for sticking with me while I tried to make sense of all this. Definitely one of those stories that leaves you thinking. Like the video, it helps more than you think.